John, thanks for inviting me to come read or reread The Glory of the Lord by Hans Urs von Balthasar. I remember to do the Urs, not Ur. I keep wanting to do Hans Ur von Balthasar.
Yeah, no, you're most welcome, Christopher. Happy to do this. So for those of you who may be watching this, Christopher and I are both MFA holders from the University of St. Thomas, a unique program that is a kind of, offers instruction in writing, but also a theological liberal education. So we encountered the introduction to the glory of the Lord in one of our courses. So I was kind of like, we should maybe read the whole book. We've both talked about that. And now we're embarking on this journey.
I read the introduction for the class. I am pretty convinced I did not understand it. I'm fairly sure I did not reference it in any essays I wrote. I could tell there was something there. I enjoyed it. I wanted to reread it or finish it, but it didn't happen until you kind of pushed me on it. My copy is at least the cover is a little bit battered here, but it's from Ignatius Press, this translation, the good folks over there. But the subtitle is A Theological Aesthetics, and this is, in its own strange way, it is a book of philosophical or theological aesthetics. And once you know about von Balthasar and you read any other theology, you're reading any journals, his name keeps coming up as like almost a bête noire that theologians have to deal with, just because he's so important, but no one necessarily wants to embrace him, is what the impression I get. I might almost compare him to Heidegger. I think we all know that Heidegger is one of the preeminent philosophers of the 20th century, but no one necessarily wants to be a Heideggerian.
Right.
These are very different reasons. Obviously, Heidegger allied himself to the Nazi Party. Hans Urs Von Balthasar is Catholic priest, a well-respected theologian. So not that comparison, but just someone who, for various reasons, forged a unique path that maybe folks need to grapple with, don't necessarily want to go down. And he talks about the true, the good, and the beautiful. It's very old. I believe that's from Plato, right? Is that a Platonic formulation or Neoplatonic?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so beauty, the third transcendental, and kind of he sees it being viewed as the third wheel. And so he says, I'm going to make it kind of the first wheel. He makes a comparison of that aesthetics or beauty is usually the last word philosophers. And you think there of Kant's Critiques, where the third volume is the one that deals with aesthetics. First to epistemology and then ethics and then aesthetics. True, good, beautiful. But he wants to make it the first. And so he kind of dives in and comes at it from a different angle. I see like beauty as an integral path to God, not just like a sign or a way, sort of not like, I don't know, I guess maybe he sees being viewed as contingent path to God, but he sees it as being necessary. Does that track with what you're getting? And again, I'm fairly sure I still don't understand it.
Yeah, no, definitely. There were a lot of parts in there that I thought, I know obviously Hans Urs von Balthasar is from Switzerland, but there's a kind of German intellectual writing that particularly when it's translated, you're just kind of, whoa, when you read it. I remember I didn't mention Heidegger, but I remember the first time I encountered Hegel, I had to have multiple people explain it to me, and I still don't think I fully grasped his ideas, but nevertheless. I think that's exactly right. I think he wants to sort of elevate beauty to a kind of primary position. And what I appreciated about this introduction was he seemed to demonstrate how there has been a kind of flattening of the human experience, particularly when seen in a theological way, like human beings are a relation to God and spiritual life. it seems to suggest that the modern age has led to a flattening, and for a variety of reasons. The sort of fractures of the Protestant Reformation, and leading to a kind of collapse of form, a formlessness, right? Leading to a kind of misunderstanding of God, of human life, the purpose of the beautiful. But again, what I appreciate about that presentation is that he brought receipts, right? Like, there are a lot of people he was quoting, and so, since both of us have obviously studied these kinds of things in this program and before, when somebody says, well, the modern age has led to a collapse, you almost sometimes have to go, okay, how? Everybody says this, like, what are you bringing to the table? But like, again, there were real receipts here, and you could kind of see the intellectual shift that was occurring. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, the bring receipts, because when I hear those things, I sort of instinctively get my hackles up, because we do hear it so often, because people assert it. And actually, I'll just make a pitch for some of the stuff that you've written. You've written some wonderful essays about your work as an educator and dealing with students, kind of pushing back against the kids these days. You've done some wonderful essays saying, actually, the kids are fine. If you just, actually give them the material and talk to them about it, it's actually okay. And so, but I said, he brings receipts, and he's not just doing kind of like a general sort of Catholic declinism. It is a very specific thing of how, and the way we've lost beauty, though he does do some stuff later, about, that you could put into like sort of classical ideas of beauty versus, not modern. I'm not sure what he thinks about, Jackson Pollock or Joan Miro. You can maybe see him being on the side of the Renaissance, but he's not doing, like, art these days, this contemporary stuff is just awful. That is not what he means in terms of we've lost beauty. But I want to go say, you talk form and formlessness. And we mentioned that this is, true, good, beautiful, this sort of classical Platonic formulation. And he uses, or at least the translation, uses the word form all the time for beauty, but he is not talking about Plato's forms, right?
Right. Yeah, it did seem to be different. I'm sure he is perhaps having Plato in mind, but it seemed to be different, particularly because, he is, I think, attempting to sort of present or offer a kind of reminder of what a kind of theological vision is supposed to look like. So I remember he ends the introduction with, I think it was a kind of reflection on seeing Christ clearly, right? Like, so there's so obviously, perhaps building on Plato, but it just it's not exactly the same.
Yeah. On page 18 of my one edition, so beauty is the last thing which the thinking intellect dares to approach, since only it dances as an uncontained splendor around the double constellation of the true and the good and their inseparable relation to one another. So beauties are described as being, uncontained splendor, suggests a kind of formlessness. So when he uses form, he's, Plato for the form is something in this ethereal other world. This,
right.
Whereas when he uses form, he's, I think, very particularly talking about beauty as expressed on earth. The form is representing boundaries and limits, in the sense of, we see something beautiful that, the idea of framing,
Right.
I think, might be a way to think about it. And you talked about, of seeing Christ, seeing this sort of ascetic in there. And on page 29, Jesus is the word, the image, the expression, and the exegesis of God. And that is Jesus as an aesthetic,
Right.
As an aesthetic feature. Obviously, he's not contradicting anything Catholic teaching or Trinitarian thinking, but he really sort of sees this sort of aesthetic beauty as being integral to understanding and approaching divinity.
Right, and if I'm remembering correctly, I'll have to go grab my book for this, but I think when he sort of, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I'm remembering correctly, I think he mentioned how post-Protestant Reformation, some theologians were getting it closer than others, but there are others who were kind of maybe a bit distrustful of beauty because this was maybe seen as a kind of quasi-pagan thing or something. So it needs to be contained or thought about in a certain way that's that would prevent things that they didn't like from coming in there. But in so doing, they created a kind of limit on beauty, and to the point where I think he recommended or mentioned that this is why when many Protestant thinkers or Protestant redactors were establishing their own biblical canon, there were certain texts of the Bible that they were like, no, we don't like this. We're going to have to pull it because it just doesn't work for our theology. Yeah.
Yeah, he has a whole section, later on in the book, about, sort of Protestant aesthetics and how in attempting to correct, they went too far, which I think is sort of the general, feeling, all due respect to my Protestant family and friends of Catholic thinkers, about the Reformation, of like, obviously, the crude sale of indulgences, and the greed of many members of the clergy. We can understand that happened. We can all just read books about the Medici popes, but kind of going too far. Like, they need to be reformed, but this is an example of like the Protestant Reformation kind of going too far, and eliminating beauty. And he is not putting forward an idea. Well, he's not putting forward a program. He's definitely not saying here's how art should be. Like I mentioned, I suspect that he probably, if he took him to an exhibit of one of my favorite artists. There's a wonderful gallery of his work at the Manila Gallery right behind University of St. Thomas, Cy Twombly. I imagine if we had taken Hans to an exhibit of Cy Twombly, he would have like gone, what is this, crude garbage? But he is not trying to go, all right, everybody, let's all get back to the, before Michelangelo messed things up. He's not doing that kind of program.
Right. And I think there's, right, like, and again, we may see that later on in the text, but at least in the introduction, the purpose seems to be, let me kind of offer an intellectual history of all of this, so you can see maybe the aims of the book. And I agree. I mean, I think there's something to this because it gets to one of my kind of the ideas that I like to focus on is in kitsch and art, right, and writing. And what I've realized is, again, the Protestant Reformation gets grouped into this big thing, but obviously there are these multiple things that were occurring at the same time. But what I've found is, and perhaps this relates to Balthasar, but the further you get from, a kind of, however you want to put it, capital C or small c Catholic understanding of things, the more there are distortions, because I look at, say, England, right? Obviously, one of the major players in the broader Protestant Reformation. We can, we can complain all we want about, the Anglican Church or the Church of, the Episcopal Church here and everything, but
which is the church I was raised in,
right,
but converting to Catholicism.
Right, but nevertheless, right, like if you go to, like I've been to Episcopalian, I don't know if masses would be the right word, but maybe services or something, right?
Yeah, we call them services.
Yeah,
or just church. I guess probably mass maybe was used, but I don't recall it.
But what struck me was, and I've been to both in like a Catholic mass that was of the Anglican ordinariate, and I've been to an Episcopalian, friends of mine who were married in the Episcopal Church, so 2 weddings and then 1 Catholic ordinary, Anglican ordinariate, right? But obviously the ordinariate thing, I'll kind of move to a side for a second. But like, if I go to the 2 times I'd gone to the Episcopal Church for my friends, there's much of it's still recognizable in a lot of ways. There's still stained glass. There's still an appreciation of hymns. There's still,
the liturgy is very often the actual phrasing in liturgy is very often the same or very similar.
Right, the liturgy is very similar. The phrasing is similar, and what struck me too, post Vatican II, a lot of Catholic churches have dispensed with this, but it struck me that the Episcopal Church people were receiving communion at an altar rail, and that kind of stood out to me. So I mention all of this because, again, it's clear to me that, again, the closer you are to, again, small c or capital C Catholicism, you retain a lot of the kind of depth of understanding. But the further you move away from that intellectually, spiritually, I think it leads to a flattening, a distortion. And again, I will include our own church in this. I mean, I think sometimes there are attempts in our church to say, well, we don't need this or this kind of thing, and it leads to a flattening, right? So when I think of, again, where these distortions can lead, at least artistically, Terrence Malick, the great filmmaker, is not Catholic, but I think has a kind of small c Catholic sensibility. And I think his films like A Hidden Life or To the Wonder.
But The Wonders of my favorite film. Right. Is a wonderful performance by Javier Bardem of the Catholic priest in a poor rural community. It was just fantastic.
Right, exactly. And I think, and again, obviously he's certainly engaged with Catholicism too. So we have To the Wonder. I think I agree. I think that particular scene where he is kind of ministering to people after he's recovered his faith, praying the prayer of St. Patrick is fantastic.
What is this love that loves us?
Right.
I remember.
Then Tree of Life, like these are serious films that are concerned with the beautiful, right? And I think, in my view, they have achieved a kind of timelessness. But when we look at the broader culture, how many people have seen them? Not many. Now, what is the movie that, when you think of religiously themed films, I have not seen this, but I like to pick on it, right? God's Not Dead, an excessively pious film that is making like an argument that's sort of browbeating you over the head with something, right? And again, somebody can accuse me of being dismissive here because I've never seen it, but like I know the type, right? Like I know.
We all know the type, yeah.
Right, right. So it's like I don't think I need to see it to say this. So, so I think that's where you can kind of see this distortion, a leveling of beauty, a leveling of a kind of depth of understanding of God and of human life into this small, kitschy thing. And I don't think these things are good for us.
And I can appreciate kitsch. Who was it? It was Sontag. camp. Notes on, was it notes on?
Yeah, notes on camp.
Yeah. But yeah, of sort of rational arguments that miss sort of that final leap, which I think, even though he says it's going to be the first thing, that I think that Balthasar sort of projects, this beauty as being part of that final leap. That he talks about, early on, that formless thing that envelops the true and the good. It's sort of like this binding agent. And there's this great line here. And an aesthetic sensibility and its standards will come into play precisely where metaphysics and ethics attempt to achieve a final reconciliation harmony of that, the true and the good. The true in this case being, metaphysics, regarding, metaphysics, epistemology, but I think it's, referring to here, and of course, ethics, the good, that the final reconciliation is only possible with the third element. And as I'm saying this, you could also probably see this as a metaphor for the Trinity.
Exactly.
Well, needing that third element. And I want to bring up another book, which I have not read in years, but I am going to recommend. Elaine Scarry, 2 R's, on beauty and being just. That obviously she's not coming to it from this theological point of view, but she has a lot of thoughts that I have to wonder if she read von Balthasar about the value of beauty, that rather than, she pushed back viewing beauty as unfair in a sense. I'm not sure how close this came out to Mean Girls or some of those, or the various Pygmalion teen movies. But that, seeing something beautiful can lead us to an appreciation of things which are not obviously beautiful, or understanding the importance and value of creation and of the world. And he seems to me to be kind of touching on this here. And I think there is that attachment to this world. I still go back to the form. I mean, when you hear form and, a dense, philosophically minded book, you want to go back to Plato.
Right.
But when he says form, occasionally I think he's talking about more Platonic forms. Or at least, again, this is the translation. But most of the time, it is something much more earthly. That the form of beauty is something we encounter on earth. Actually, just before that quote I read, more than either metaphysics or ethics, aesthetics tends towards an immanental self-transfiguration on the part of the world, even if it's only for the moment when the beautiful first catches the eye. So it is an expression in the world.
Right.
Please ignore all the overdone philosophical jargon and gobbledygook. Ignore words like immanental, self-transfiguration, etc. But it is something we encounter in the world, that we see beauty in the world, and it catches our eye. And then from there, this is what goes on to give us the ability to reconcile the true and the good. And so in that sense, we were talking, off camera earlier about the Trinity and its mysterious nature, that, the three, and, there's 3 distinct persons, but also a unity, that he is not really going for a unity here. That the beauty is kind of like this third thing. That is separate and necessary. I think, maybe it will be united later, but right now it is this separate thing, maybe because he is trying to defend its value.
Yeah, and again, I think, right, like as we discussed, again, referencing Plato, but go beyond. And I remember again towards the end of the introduction, he's mentioning the work that, say, Augustine or Thomas Aquinas had done to sort of also bring in beauty into kind of a theological understanding. And I think what's interesting say about the Greeks, right? Like the language of the Greeks we use still all the time, and I've pointed this out to actually students before. People don't realize it, right? Like, so if somebody's watching a basketball game and they say so and so has a beautiful shot, it's because the form is perfect. And again, like, you know, we have to ask that question, like, obviously, like, what does this perfection point to, right? So again, Balthasar reminds us to Christ.
And you talk about the Greeks. I made a note that in this translation there's some references primarily to Hellenistic rather than Hellenic, which, for those of you that aren't familiar with this sort of distinction, that Hellenistic is usually used to refer to after the fall of Alexander, and sort of this spread of Greek culture across the Mediterranean, even to the east. You know, you have the Indo-Greek kingdoms in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bactria, but it's this sort of this post-classical world. You know, the world, you know, after Plato and the great Greek philosophers that preceded him, more or less after Aristotle. I know not completely, but yes, the Aristotle is at the end of that, rather than Hellenic. But of course, that Hellenistic is the world, the philosophical world that preceded Christ on earth, and that, you know, figures like Paul is dealing with. I struggle a lot with Paul's letters, and you can see the difference, I think, when he's, you know, writing to the Hebrews versus the Romans in the letters, when he uses much more philosophical formulations. To my mind, one that came up in a recent Sunday Mass reminded me of some of the Stoic if and logic formulations. So it is like but you know, I have no idea whether this is important for him, Hellenic versus Hellenistic, but it did strike me. And it does bring up, you know, what is important, because he quotes so many philosophers and thinkers that I do not know and that I have not read. So I'm wondering, to what extent is he saying that these are correct? How much will I understand if I had read, like I'm looking right here, Johann Georg Hamann? No idea who this is. Who we will consider at length in our typology of theological aesthetics. So I assume I'm going to be deeply confused when we hit that chapter. Was alone in seeing that the real problem was how to construct a theory of beauty, aesthetica, in nuce, that's in parentheses, in such a way that in it the total aspiration of worldly and pagan beauty is fulfilled, while all glory is at the same time given to God and Jesus Christ. And, you know, I have kind of like a note there, like, this is obviously referring to another philosopher, but it also sounds like this might be his ultimate goal in some way. That's why, you know, I connected the Greeks, and, you know, it's always a big question, I think, for, you know, art and philosophy and theology. What do we do with classical thought and classical beauty, pagan beauty? Plato, we keep on talking about, you know, is this Platonic forms? Yes, no, probably not, because Plato hangs over so much of Christian thought. You know, it's like he is this clearly pagan thinker that we can't leave. You know, what was I wish I could quit you from Brokeback Mountain?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, again, like, I think it would be, for me, it would be wrong to reject the Greeks. However, because and again, I agree, like, this has been a kind of thing in the tradition. Tertullian was hostile, I believe, toward the Greeks. You know, people were distrustful of Thomas Aquinas when he was attempting to kind of meld Aristotle with theology. But what I've found, and this particularly came through in my own studies as of late, like, so, like, one of my courses I designed at work was a kind of survey great books course on a variety of thinkers, right? And some of which I referenced in the essays that Christopher was talking about. When you read, say, Aristotle's Ethics, right, the Nicomachean Ethics, so much of his understanding of virtue and perhaps even holiness it feels familiar, but nevertheless, despite the fact that Aristotle, I think, has a really good and fair understanding of people, character types, how we learn from each other, etc. He seems to suggest that we achieve magnanimity and virtue on our own, just through pure work, and that is like kind of true for Catholics, right? Like, we can achieve a kind of natural virtue on our own, but it's not going to get us enough. This is where, again, supernatural grace comes in and can form us, and help us to do things that we would not be able to do on our own. Which, again, I mean, for somebody totally outside of the tradition, they might hear this and go like, what are you talking about? Like a radioactive spider biting you and making you do this? But it's like, no, like, but the depth of radical love and service one might experience after an encounter with God's grace in a real way. Just to use the semi-modern example here, right? Like, Dorothy Day's encounter with grace leads her to found the Catholic worker movement, right? Like, so it's like who, and or even like outside of Catholicism, right? Like Martin Luther King's witness that he provided during the civil rights movement. And again, like, people kind of go like, okay, well, what about the flaws in his personal life? It's like, but who cares, right? Like, we're all sinners, right? The kind of the witness that he provided is almost, again, it's indicative of something beyond us, and I think that's what perhaps Balthasar is trying to remind us of too.
Towards the end of the introduction, Romantic theology ultimately failed because of the deep theological inadequacy, namely that did not sufficiently distinguish between creation and revelation, or to formulate it in the terms of our inquiry, we can say the Romantic theology foundered on a kind of aesthetic and religious monism. I actually probably should have skipped that last sentence there. Though monism is sort of like a monad, this sort of single self-contained, which does go to what I said earlier of beauty, aesthetics as something separate, as a distinct, I'm going to use the word form, even though it's incredibly dangerous here, distinct form, separate from the true and the good. But this creation revelation, I think here that revelation in a way is similar to the grace you're talking about. And obviously, theologically, revelation, grace, different, but this extra something besides the rational. My own journey, I was initially seduced, as it were, by rational ideas around Catholicism and some things that struck me intellectually, but it was ultimately grace revelation that pushed me to take the final step. And I think maybe he is going to push beauty as that final extra, not irrational, maybe super rational in the sense of supernatural beyond thing. And something that you and I have talked before that comes up, I believe, in the next chapter. He uses the word gnosis a lot. And we've talked about wanting to recover the word gnosis, Gnostic. That I wish it just hadn't been sort of used as a catch-all for various heresies. That's such a wonderful word for a kind of revealed knowledge that is not irrational, but also beyond rational. And I'm thinking here that maybe by positing beauty as being connected to revelation, as this thing you told earlier, that catches fire in the eye, this thing that goes, takes that extra final step. That to knit together the true and the good, you need something that is beyond sort of the rationalism of those things, and that beauty might be it.
Right, exactly. And again, I think that's, that's why, again, it's reason and revelation, right? Like, I think operating totally on a kind of rational, reason-based view is a problem, right? Again, it leads to these distortions that I've mentioned, distorts our view of creation of human life. I did an essay a few years ago in a now defunct journal on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and I said Vince Gilligan's aim on those shows, more so I think on Breaking Bad, but nevertheless, wanted to critique a purely rational view of things. Like Walter White is a man of science. He has there's no theology in the show really. And I think to me, one of the great scenes in that show was when, in a flashback, he and his then girlfriend are mapping out the human body. And he says, well, we've accounted for 99% of everything in the human body. What are we missing here? And she says, the soul, in a very earnest way. And he scoffs at it. So I think this shows the limits of that, because what does he become? He becomes a monster. He becomes one of the great villains of television, at least, in the past 20 years or so.
And how far can we get without beauty? Now,
Right.
I think Von Balthasar would reject that we could get 99% of the way. I don't think we can get that far. But that idea, there is this final thing, like he mentioned very early introduction, the idea of, that beauty encompasses or envelops the true and the good. You can almost think of like a cell in a way. That beauty is the fluid inside the cell membrane that holds the organelles, and the good is the organelles, but beauty as this thing which envelops it. You could call it the cell membrane. I don't think it's quite adequate, because there's something that lacks the formlessness that he seems to put in. Gosh, okay, Plato's so hard here. The Platonic form of beauty is formless, whereas this appearance on earth is a form. And I've just confused everybody, including myself. And I found another section that I do not understand, but it's about Plato and classical philosophy. He's getting towards the end here, the introduction where he's kind of setting up the challenges. And I think because he is trying to say we got to get away from this Platonic and also Aristotelian formulation. Because God effects that which he reveals in the sign, and because in God's order salvation, Plato's idealistic imago metaphysics and Aristotle's realistic causa et finis metaphysics actually come together in a higher plane, we can never approach Christian eros and Christian beauty from a merely Platonic tradition and expect to interpret them adequately. The enthusiasm which is there in the Christian faith is not merely idealistic. It is rather enthusiasm which derives from and is appropriate to actual realistic being. And he also talks about that, God's word bring about a kind of false enthusiasm. I'm not sure he'll go more in detail of what that means, but he is, I think maybe he sees Plato and Aristotle as being too rational or lacking that 1%. That final thing. And he's not saying, and of course it'd be wrong to say, that Plato and Aristotle don't have an aesthetics, don't have an idea of beauty. They clearly do. And the idea of beauty, particularly in Plato, is this thing which underlies so much of philosophy and thought. I would suspect that Aristotle probably comes closer for him, but in a way, Aristotle's definitely, I think, I don't use the word rational, but perhaps more scientific than Plato. Because rational with rationalism, it has its own implications beyond just sort of the Aristotle's more rational in the colloquial sense of rational.
Right. I mean, I think Aristotle's, you know, I know the kind of going mode in at least our program was a kind of Christian Platonism, which I think is fine. I understand that, but like I've always considered myself more of an Aristotelian figure, which I don't know. Which it's true, but I mean the fact that I just said that I feel like I'm now a pretentious 20-year-old college student again at a cafe going, well, I've always considered myself more of an Aristotelian, but and I mean I think Aristotle particularly, you know, I've read the Politics, I've read Poetics, I've read the Nicomachean Ethics, obviously, so I'm going to focus on that, but I think his presentation of people, how they operate, makes sense to me, and I think it's akin to life, right? Like, I mean, again, this is not a knock on Plato, but Plato it seems to have suggested at times that if somebody's a bad person, it's just because they haven't had enough philosophical education, right? And we can give them that education; they'll be good. Aristotle would not say that.
No.
This is like a kind of character deficiency that the person has, and they can work to overcome it, or sometimes people are so far gone that it's going to be really hard. And that seems more akin to life to me than Plato's vision.
It's off topic, but sort of, one of the great questions for Western philosophy, it's not just Plato versus Aristotle. Is to what extent is Aristotle sufficiently different?
Right.
You consider, we took several classes together where the idea that the Christian Platonic tradition as sort of this overarching thing that really dominates all of Western thought. And I struggle with that because, in part because I feel that Aristotle diverged sufficiently and he was so influential that it is sort of separate, that his influence. So I think it kind of breaks it up. And you can toss in there that Aristotle himself, how much of our understanding is Aristotle is Thomas Aquinas's interpretations of Ibn Rushd's footnotes on Aristotle.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something hanging over here. I don't think that Von Balthasar is going to be the sword that cuts that Gordian knot for us.
Right.
But I think maybe before we come to an end, as towards the end of this introduction, which readers beware, it is over 100 pages long paragraphs. There are a couple breaks, but if you've ever read Proust, where you go, I'm going to read till I find like a nice stopping point, and you find out that the paragraph is 20 pages long.
It's. I was thinking of that when we were revisiting it, because I was like, this introduction could be a book unto itself, published on its own. And it reminds me of, I know it's not philosophy, but I've tried and failed, nothing against the book, but I've tried and failed to read Don DeLillo's Underworld a couple times.
Same here.
Yeah. And that's
the shorter books.
Yeah. And that similarly has a very long prologue,
the baseball game at the beginning.
The baseball game, which is also, I think, about 200 pages or 125 pages. And I think that's been published as a novella. So, yeah.
No, so reader beware. It is hard to just sort of, I'll just, it's not what a friend of mine called a bathroom book. A book you keep like, okay, I'm going to be in here for about 5 minutes. Let me, pick up and read a few pages. Von Balthasar does not work very well with that.
This is not a beach read, right?
No, you need okay, I got to set aside at least a solid hour just to get to a reasonable stopping point where I won't get confused when I pick it up again. But towards the very end of introduction, so if this is so, of course, there he's summing up the previous 120 pages. The theological aesthetics must be properly developed in 2 phases, which are the theory of vision or fundamental theology, aesthetics in the Kantian sense, as a theory about perception of the form of God's self-revelation. So there he's I think may go back to what I said about framing, because I think Kant has a bit of that kind of aesthetics is some set by like this setting aside beauty.
Right.
We frame something. That's what enables it to be beautiful.
Sure.
Though I don't recall Kant coming up very much. And there, I mentioned him earlier, but that was not from him. That was, Kant's critiques is representing those three parts. 2, the theory of rapture or dogmatic theology, aesthetics as a theory about the incarnation of God's glory and the consequent elevation of man to participate in that glory. So far, I'm probably closer to the theory of vision. And we did kind of skip over a section where he talks about vision and writing. He talks about the Hebrews as being more a people of words rather than visual beauty, but he also kind of connects written language to visual beauty. I wonder what he thought about like concrete poetry or typological art. Maybe not much, but definitely he opens the door for those things.
Right.
Again, it's probably the clearest answer that when he says form, he is not talking about Plato, and that maybe he is talking about something more Kantian. I have not read Critique of Judgment in many, many, many years. The only one I reread, the only one I read twice was Critique of Practical Reason. Because the first time I read, I was like, wow, I think I agree with a lot of this. I went back and reread it. Critique of Pure Reason, I read, and then had to read about it to understand it.
Yeah, I haven't read too much Kant. I probably should, but the little excerpts I've read, I find him very rigid. So
because of all the German philosophers that he will talk about later, like I quoted earlier, I read from his, paraphrasing of someone named Hamann, who I'd never heard of. There's also someone I think named Newbel, who appears a lot later on, who I've never heard of. I should probably Google them, but I haven't. But you're going to see a lot of German philosophers and theologians who, unless you're a better man than I, which hopefully you are, you've not heard of. But any final thoughts on the introduction to, again, Hans Urs von Balthasar's The Glory of the Lord, a Theological Aesthetics, Volume 1, Seeing the Form. I should add, this is Volume 1 of 5, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Maybe when we're retired, we'll finish the 5th one.
Yeah, no, I'm happy we're doing this. I'm happy that we're revisiting the text because, as I mentioned earlier, you and I both talked about how we enjoyed the text, but we were only assigned the introduction, so it's like we want to finish it. I'm eager to see where the book goes, which, again, if somebody were to walk in right now and hear that, it's like, oh, you're reading some beach read? Like, no. But I found the introduction magisterial. I found it to be, again, I appreciated its depth of intellectual history. It challenged me. It reminded, I'll borrow a phrase from my friend Trey, who, when he and I were attempting to do a similar thing with David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, which neither of us finished, but we were starting it, and he said, Wallace wants us to work. And I think Balthasar wants us to work. I think he wants us to really, see these names and kind of go, let me look this up. Either that or he's presuming familiarity with them. But whatever the case, I feel challenged by it, and I want to see where this goes, because I do have a sense that this could be one of the most transformative books of theology I've read.
And I'm not going to promise when, but we are going to start reading the next section, which is called The Subjective Evidence. And this is where he does talk about gnosis, which I'm so excited about to kind of get into. But hopefully, I'm not going to promise a week, but maybe in a week and a half. I think a week for us to finish, but then another half a week to set up a time to meet and do this again. But if you're one of the 5 people watching, I hope you'll come back for section 2, subjective evidence, beginning with the light of faith, pistis, and gnosis. John, thank you again for calling me up and saying we need to reread this, because I had started rereading it and then kind of like put it down, and it kind of sat where I left it for months. And so you made me pick it up again and finish that project we both talked about after reading it for class, going, we can't do it right now because we have the reading to do. We have jobs. We are not professional scholars. I know John's an educator. I'm a communications consultant, but we both do this in our spare time. But so glad you got me to finish this project.
Oh yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be doing this, so it'll be fun.
Well, I will see you in about a week and a half.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.